Yu-Gi-Oh's Toon monsters are perhaps some of the oddest relics in the game. They're a series of cards that were created before the inception of archetypes in the game. But despite that, they were very clearly conceived as being a collective deck much like an archetype, so they were given the classification of a subtype, all while still being named Toons. Between every existing Toon monster, there's a clear variation in what rules they're willing to adhere to. The Toons have a collection of common rules. Most of them can't attack the turn they're summoned, most of them can attack directly while Toon World is on the field, and your opponent doesn't control a Toon. Most of them also have the added downside that if Toon World blows up, they blow up. Some of them can be special summoned if you control Toon World, with the special summonable monsters making you pay 500 life points when they attack, save for Harpy Lady and Dark Magician Girl, who can also attack the turn she is summoned. There's not a lot of consistency behind what rules they adhere to in later support, making it unclear just what exactly a Toon monster is mechanically. I thought Comic Hand might be the best we have to go off of in understanding what it means to be a Toon monster mechanically, as it turns a monster into a Toon, which then also applies a singular added effect. That being, a Toon monster mechanically is a monster that can attack directly while you control Toon World. Then the new wave of support contradicted this, so we may never know what a Toon is. But even disregarding that, this implies the varying restrictions on the old ones are their effects. Toon Alligator might have been onto something. This highlights the biggest problem with Toons. These are some of the most horribly aged cards in the game. It's extremely difficult to salvage them, since cards whose only designed effects restrict the card itself can't really be spun as a positive. Even back then, the restrictions made them unplayably bad. In a modern context, design has to do something drastic about it. But even over time, other issues with their design have rotted their worth. One of the unique concepts behind Toon was that they would toonify existing monsters in the game. These Toons, based on pre-existing monsters, typically had the same effect as the monsters they're a Toon of, seeing as Comic Hand was used to take Ancient Gear Golem and toonify it in the anime, with it retaining the original effect. This philosophy makes sense mechanically, but this gets put into question with some other Toons. Dark Magician and the swath of Toons based on Vanillas have effects unique to the named archetype of Toon. This makes sense, since vanilla Toons wouldn't exactly be appealing. But it raises the question, what is future Toon support supposed to be? As it seemed like it would continue marching down the path of printing Toon versions of other cards, while not attempting to make Toon as a deck a coherent strategy. Originally, this video was supposed to be an entry in a series about mechanics Konami's neglected. However, we've actually received support that addresses a lot of Toon's problems. It's support that genuinely feels like it understands just how to make sense of these utterly chaotic string of cards. Despite that, as good as these genuinely are, it still feels too little too late. But before we get into that, it's best we actually discuss these new cards first. The core monsters of this new wave of support feature non-Toon Toon monsters. This does have the issue that Contents and Page Flip can't get them, but Toon Bookmark can, so it's not the end of the world. Just a little inconvenient. These are all based on other wacky cards that Pegasus liked. These are all monsters that are treated as Toons, and actually work to support the functionality of a coherent strategy for the deck. They support Toon the archetype, as well as Toon the sub-mechanic, while Blue Eye's Ultimate Toon gives us a unique design gimmick. However, it's best to talk about the new Toon World itself before discussing all of these cards, since it encapsulates the entire gameplay loop that the archetype is shooting for. Toon World, the perfect world, is yet another card that's treated as Toon World. The decision to make it a field spell, and the deck's core identity, does mean Kingdom is now replaced. While the original Toon World needed to be replaced, Kingdom was actually worth keeping, at least on a surface level. Preventing your opponent from targeting any of your monsters is only a tolerable design philosophy if the monsters are bad. The decision to replace it signals to me that they actually want you to control good monsters, which is of course a net positive. Considering it's also a consistency boosting card, it's a card you absolutely should be playing, especially since its search is thrice per turn. Instead of the annoying stall tactic of Kingdom, Perfect World introduces a new and far more interesting design gimmick, one that actually addresses their oldest design issue in the process. You can banish a Toon temporarily to make it dodge effects. They designed it in such a way that you can also chain this effect to any other effect when it activates, allowing you to activate a card on your own to banish them. the only restriction being that it can't banish the same name again in the same turn. This has the added benefit of using game rules to nullify Toon's age-old "can't attack the turn they're summoned" clause, letting the deck actually have offensive power. But the most compelling aspect of this design allows them to exploit soft once per turns, of which were even printed on some of the new cards, allowing you to use their effect, banish them, then return to use them once again. Funny Dark Rabbit is the big name of the newest batch, being based on Pegasus's favorite Toon. He lets you place a Toon continuous or field spell from deck to field, being pivotal due to getting the new field spell out. The banish reset then allows you to place another copy of the field spell. Despite this importance, there is still some elements lacking in its design. Rabbit has the on-summon effect to provide you with an additional normal summon of a monster that mentions Toon World, something that would normally be decent in any other archetype, but ironically, most Toons already special summon, so it feels kind of redundant. It's not offensively bad, it's just a bit out of place for the deck's current state, only really serving a purpose for another specific card in this wave of support. The other missing element is in the fact that it can play a continuous spell from the deck. There's only one continuous spell, and that's the original Toon World. A card they legitimately can't salvage in any way, because its only effect is that you take 1000 damage to activate it. It'd be nice if Rabbit didn't only exclusively get the field spell, since it would give him more utility in games. But without a new continuous spell, he has one job, and that's it. Regardless of its impact, it's still a bit of a shame. Evil Box is a trap searcher that you can summon for free if you have Toon World, letting you fetch a trap by adding it or setting it immediately. I wonder what trap he could possibly get. There are at least 2 targets. Toon Briefcase is an okay piece of on-summon removal, but of course, most people are just going to opt to play Toon Terror, since it's infinitely better. This gives the deck the ability to end on an Omni-Negate consistently. It's good, but it's also pretty boring. The deck's not interested in running the other traps just because, even with Evil Box, especially when its other 2 best options are a Trap Hole and a janky E-Tele. Since it doesn't let you activate them the turn they're set, Evil Box is only useful if you're going first. Mask could be somewhat playable, but that would require there to be a good disruptive Toon for it to summon, of which there are none of, as even the best disruptive monster introduced in this wave is not a Toon in name. Evil Box also has the ability to quick effect Disrupt the Grave, targeting a card, then stacking it to the bottom of the deck. And this effect isn't a once per turn, which is a neat bit of interaction potentially, but on a card that's primary function is to set an Omni-Negate, it really doesn't liven up the utility of the card. While these cards are good, it's already becoming a clear pattern that the foundation they're built on has more issues that weren't fully addressed. Comic Cat is the most interesting card of the batch with the deck's current infrastructure. Comic Cat lets you quick effect tribute a monster to summon out a monster that mentions Toon World from deck. And if you have Toon World, you can tribute your opponent's monster instead. This gives the deck obscenely powerful removal that boosts your plays. The problem is, Comic Cat doesn't do anything else, while also not being free to summon. You really don't want to spend your normal on this guy, leaving it to feel like Rabbit's additional normal summon is specifically for Cat. The only traditional Toon monster introduced in this wave of support also introduced a new design gimmick for the archetype. Blue Eyes Toon Ultimate Dragon is Toon's first extra deck monster. It's a fusion that doesn't require poly, making it so the deck doesn't suddenly need an awkward fusion spell introduced. Instead, it's another card in the modern style of contact fusions, letting you use materials in hand, field, or grave by shuffling them back to deck. It requires 3 Toons for material, with 1 needing to be Toon Blue Eyes. It requiring a name incentivizes playing the old names, but doesn't force you to play a bunch of them. And the fact its summoning condition is so flexible, the names really aren't that bad to draw. Of course, you want to be using as many materials from grave as possible, but that's hardly a problem. This new Toon is absurdly crucial to the deck's new gameplay loop as well. While Rabbit can only abuse his soft once per turn on the field spell, Ultimate can abuse his to grab any spell in archetype that's in grave. Notably, this has been shown off mostly to facilitate dumb FTKs with Eradicator Warlock, but in principle gives them the ability to recycle their search spells to provide the deck with even more consistency. It has 2 other effects, with one being more relevant than the other. It lets all Toon monsters attack directly, which exists solely so they didn't have to print that line of text on all of the new non-Toon Toons. The more important effect is the battle effect, further building off Perfect's new design philosophy. You can make your Toons dodge battle. Because of the specific wording of during damage calculation, it avoids the battle while preventing the monster from being able to redeclare, making them entirely capable of dodging attacks. While it is a phenomenal cornerstone of the deck, it certainly doesn't perform the role of a boss monster, which considering its design isn't really a bad thing, but it's the only existing boss-like card for the deck, leaving this wave to feel somewhat hollow despite all the powerful tools at its disposal. Of course, the new support contained 2 other cards, but I've been putting off talking about them for a very specific reason. They're not really Toon cards. They don't actually do anything related to the new or old cards, making them a disappointment in an otherwise uplifting wave of support. Not because they're unplayable garbage, but because they didn't further cultivate this new direction, feeling like they wasted 2 slots of support that would have been better spent on cards that actually furthered this new design. Instead, these remaining 2 cards would introduce an undesirable design element to the deck. These 2 exist almost purely to be a reference to the Millennium Eye. Faceless Mage lets you discard it from hand to grab and reborn a monster that mentions Toon World from grave, or the clear other effect they want you to use, place Mind Scan face up on your field. Mind Scan makes your opponent play the game with their hand revealed, with the added bonus of just letting you look at your opponent's set cards whenever you feel like it, giving you perfect knowledge on your opponent's cards. Perfect hand knowledge is becoming a concerningly common design pattern, with Rotary in particular bringing it to a boiling point. It fits this deck thematically, sure, but considering it's a common design occurrence at this point, it doesn't really get to coast off that fact. Especially when this is by far the most unhealthy iteration of it. On top of giving you perfect knowledge at all times, it has a quick effect of functionally prohibition your opponent. This functions similarly to Cross Out in its gameplay loop, since you're just using it to stop the opponent from using a given card. The only weakness to the card is that it can't stop a card whose effect is happening in the same chain as its own activation. But this is hardly relevant, since you'll fire it preemptively because you know your opponent's hand. It also doesn't have the one balancing restriction that Crossout had, that being you had to be playing the card you intend to negate. These cards don't build off the new foundation, and while they gave it a new power and perfect hand knowledge, and the ability to dictate cards your opponent can play, the design of other cards was actually interesting, so ending on these felt like a letdown to anyone that actually cared about the quality of gameplay. This wave of support in some ways feels like a reset of the archetype. How support is handled is always a messy topic. It's never a good look for an archetype when most of the original lineup isn't remotely playable in any capacity with its modern iteration. Entirely reinventing an archetype defeats the very purpose of supporting it, as you might as well have just made a new archetype entirely. But Toon is one of those cases where you genuinely can't do much to salvage their old cards. The literal namesake and core of the deck was replaced long ago, and there's zero turning back on that fact. The fact that new support sort of invalidates the Kingdom era of design feels like giving up again. But ironically, that's actually a good thing, because this new support actually gives the archetype a defined gameplay direction. Kingdom never really gave the deck a coherent win condition. It was just stall and pray you can beat your opponent to death with garbage cards eventually, something that doesn't fly whatsoever in the modern day. The actual Toon monsters are the perfect wave of support for this deck. It utilizes design that mitigates the deck's old issues by way of mechanics that only the designer of the game would think to utilize. It's genuinely wonderful in that respect. The problem is, this quite literally feels like we're back at square one with the deck. This direction is still more conceptual than actually being fully realized. Because these cards give the deck a new definition, it also subsequently leaves more to be desired. Now that the deck has a great framework, I'm actually eager to see it expanded upon. Unfortunately, that means waiting for more support, which is likely going to take a while. While it does utilize old cards, not many of them actually do anything new or meaningful in the deck's existing context. Toon Dark Magician does something new, but that's not thanks to this support. So the deck would need further support for this archetype's legacy of cards to feel important to the deck strategy, and the outline that they've provided actually makes that seem entirely possible. So what does the deck need for a revival series? Currently, Toon's being channeled into the typical combo deck, courtesy of infinite material with no locks, a searchable Omni-Negate, and repeatable effects. Zealantis is probably overkill with these cards, honestly. This has a tendency to happen now and then, but like most decks that fall into this mold, it's due to a weak archetypal win condition, so actually channeling the deck itself into something will change this fact. It doesn't need to be broken, it just has to exist. Right now, Toon has an Omni Negate and Comic Cat as disruptions. While they come alongside the new Mind Scan package, these aren't really a solid win condition either. Mind Scan can be, given its unsavory design, but I wouldn't call it a mechanically satisfying payoff for the deck. The deck is capable of OTKing on the crackback now, since you can mitigate the Toon battle problem, but of the new cards, only Rabbit is worth running multiples of, and none of the old cards are really worth running in multiples either, if even at all. Even as strong as the Mind Scan stuff is, you only want to play them as one-ofs, so the deck's still hurting on the count of names to be attacking with. Usually when I talk about future design for cards, I always come up with a ton of ideas to improve and further iterate on their design, but the foundation is so solid, I only see the need for a couple basic improvements. There's only really a legitimate boss monster that's missing for the deck to be perfectly functional, but of course this new design for the archetype has more potential beyond a singular boss monster, and I think that's what's most interesting to explore. The baseline is as simple as making more contact fusions. Ultimate's biggest downside is that it's 3 materials. If the deck has far more going on in general, and they don't all cost 3 material, there's a great design principle for the deck to revolve around. Since shuffling back 2 instead to do something useful patches the situations where Ultimate is too costly to make. There are a ton of Toons that are based on monsters from fusions. Making Toon iterations of said fusions is a great way to build off of this new direction. Ultimate requires you use the original Blue Eyes Toon as material, so all of these new fusions could carry that same principle, the names being used as a requirement to get into a fusion. This represents you flipping to the page your favorite Toon is on. This makes it so the deck doesn't always have access to everything, as names are important. You're forced to play the name Toon, and they serve an important role that's easy to enable. The issue is that they're still dead cards out of that exact context. So even if you do play multiple one-of Toons, it's still undesirable without other design benefits to lean into. So there needs to be more design to mitigate them being viewed as bad. The easiest thing I can think of is just giving them their own destiny draw, giving the deck draw power while putting garbage Toons in grave to be fused off. Of course, I don't know that Toon really needs draw power with all the searching already, especially if Ultimate recycles it, but that's the most clear-cut way to illustrate it as a non-issue for the archetype. This is the sort of dynamic they're gonna want with the contact fusions, finding ways to bin your bad names while profiting from it in the process. Toon Dark Magician is an existing card that contributes to this, but it highlights another slight issue that the deck has. While the older high-level Toons can special summon, they still require the same number of tributes to be summoned as though it were a normal tribute summon, and most of the newer ones don't have the special summon clause. Since the deck has so many high-level Toons, it'd be a good idea to add more design to the deck that lets them be summoned easier. Cat introduces tributing your opponent's monster to summon out your Toons, but this is purely by its effect. If the deck could functionally make every high-level idiot into a kaiju, this turns their summoning issue into a strong form of removal, making cards like Blue Eyes feel good to run since they can also just be a way to clear 2 bodies. But this might have to be something the deck only does do once per turn. Slap it on a continuous spell to give Rabbit more versatility, and that should be good. Just make sure it has another use beyond that, so it's worth running as a 3-of. A Foolish Burial for Toon would be the perfect fit for this new design direction, getting a material for a fusion engrave. The design dynamic around shuffling back names to use again for additional copies of the fusions is also great, making it so you only have to play one of the named materials. The deck has a ton of consistency, so it legitimately gets away with playing a bunch of one-ofs. It'd be best to come up with more infrastructure around utilizing these outdated names for generally useful effects, since this design philosophy can be channeled into something unique. As mentioned earlier, I think Toon needs more main deck monsters that do something disruptive. It really doesn't have to be much. Something basic like a pop is fine. I just feel like Comic Cat and Mask should have good targets to summon. Honestly, they could round out this era of Toon with retrains of the ugly ducklings of Toons. Mangarioran, Parrot Dragon, and Toon Alligator. Especially the vanillas, considering they really aren't included at all. Parrot Dragon has the grounds to be like the other non-Toon Toons from the latest support, but Toon Alligator is a weird one, since it's the only Toon that isn't the subtype Toon. Retraining it into an effect monster with a disruptive effect would be great to see. Since as a low-level target, it'd make Mask worth considering and Cat more effective. And since they're aiming for soft once per turns, it being the only name that provides a disruptive effect is fine, since you can very easily repeat it for multiple disruptions. If they want to try and get you to still play the original in some capacity, they could give Gator a fusion that requires a reptile Toon as material, but gets a bonus if made using a normal monster. Since they'd be the only reptile Toons in archetype, there's no need to list both names as material options. The bonus could just be that you only need one material to make it if you use the original. The fusion gimmick really does make these old cards salvageable. The only annoying thing is the difference between Toon in quotations and Toon. Most support is exiled alligator by way of not using quotes, or rely on the mention of Toon role in its text, as the lack of quotes refers to Toon the subtype, rather than Toon the named archetype, making it so only 2 cards can search it. At least, there is some hope. The fact the card named Perfect World includes Toon Alligator is really heartwarming. When it comes to manga Ryuran, I feel like I'm the only person that likes this dumb idiot. He's literally the face of Toon World, and he gets no respect. Hell, in the manga, he had the dodge effect. Unfortunately, manga Ryuran isn't remotely good. It's just another Toon that requires 2 tributes to be summoned and has the same dumb pay 500 to attack clause. The most notable thing about it is the name being an odd relic of early localization in the game. It's the only Toon monster that doesn't have Toon in its name. This is exclusive to the TCG. The early TCG felt the need to make any card named with English in the OCG to be made Japanese in the TCG translation. Things like Kage Ningen, who's literally named Shadow Fighter in the OCG. Ryuran was another case of this, as its name in the OCG is Dragon Aegir, Ryu being dragon and Ran filling in for Aegir. So when there turned out to be a Toon version of Ryuran, they decided to stay consistent with that philosophy and changed Toon to be Japanese, giving us something very funny in the process. I'd love to see a retrain of it that becomes a cornerstone of the deck. But they could also make a wholly new fusion that uses the original name. Since he has such importance, he could be a good case for a 1-card fusion using the original name, turning the literal face of Toon World into the deck's best starter, without needing to implement periphery support throughout the archetype just to extract worth from him. Maybe it's just me, but I'd love to unironically be able to play 3 manga Ryuran and Toon Alligator and have that actually be optimal. The archetype's contact fusions really do give the opportunity for that to be a reality. Other than unlocking use for the old Toons, there's only one other element the archetype should focus on, that being on its integration of Relinquished. Faceless Mage represents this aesthetically, but not really mechanically. Pegasus's Relinquished cards were illusion monsters pre-illusion monsters. I'd like to see them actually integrate these cards into Toon's design, maybe even go so far as to have a Toon Relinquished, with a unique ritual summon clause based on Toons, similar to the contact fusion gimmick. Given the newly adopted fusion angle, they could even have a new Relinquished retrain that absorbs a monster that can then quick effect fuse into any of the restrict fusions using it and the equip. Toon always toyed around with the gimmick of stealing and toonifying your opponent's monsters, something that was harshly contrasted by Relinquished and Restrict absorbing the monsters in a more grotesque and terrifying way. They could bridge these 2 methods of taking an opponent's cards together as the deck's main form of disruption. Carrying ritual design in the deck also opens up another bit of design overlap to lean into. By introducing cards that profit off of being tributed, both parts of the deck come together mechanically. Since the old Toons tribute for their special summon, it would give summoning them use. And since ritual summoning also counts as tributing, the new hypothetical Relinquished stuff could also trigger them, making the full Pegasus deck actually cohesive in gameplay. Hell, it'd even give Cannon Soldier a legitimate use. There's a ton of potential Toon's new design direction offers. It genuinely makes me excited to see more support for Toon. Something that beforehand, I genuinely didn't care about, because it always felt like the archetype would be a gimmicky relic of the past. But now, it really doesn't take a whole lot to make this deck into something phenomenal. I only hope when they get support in the future, it's able to make good on this new wave of support. At least, once we decide we're not letting this hang around in the game.